Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. 9 years ago, when I was 15, my family packed up our entire life and moved from the suburbs to a small mountain town in northwest North Carolina. The transition felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Our new house sat on 3 acres of partially cleared land, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the closest grocery store required a 20-minute drive down winding mountain roads. My parents, David and Susan, had grown tired of city life and wanted to give my younger brother Tommy and me a taste of rural living. Tommy was 11 at the time, still young enough to find adventure in catching fireflies and building forts, but old enough to understand that this move meant leaving behind friends and familiar places. For me, the isolation felt like freedom. No more crowded hallways at school, no more traffic noise at night. Just the endless expanse of wilderness right outside our back door. The house itself was a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch that offered panoramic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What captivated me most was how the forest seemed to press against our property line, as if nature was reclaiming its territory 1 inch at a time. Deer would graze in our backyard during dawn and dusk, and the calls of barred owls echoed through the darkness each night. Within our first week, we met Dan Carpenter, our nearest neighbor who lived down a gravel road that disappeared into the woods across from our driveway. Dan was a weathered man in his 60s with calloused hands and knowing eyes who had lived on his property for over 30 years. He owned nearly 200 acres of mixed hardwood and pine forest, land that had been in his family for generations. When he learned about my interest in hiking and the outdoors, he graciously offered to let me explore his property. "Just respect the land," he told me one evening, as we stood on his front porch, watching the sun set behind the tree line. "These mountains have been here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Treat them right, and they'll show you things most folks never get to see." The weight of his words settled over me like a promise. I had no idea how prophetic they would prove to be, or how the mountains would indeed show me something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. That first Saturday morning in October arrived crisp and clear, with frost coating the grass and our breath visible in the cool mountain air. The leaves had begun their spectacular transformation, painting the mountainsides in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. It was the kind of morning that demanded exploration, and I was determined to venture deeper into Dan's property than I had gone before. Convincing Tommy to join me took considerable effort. He preferred his video games and comic books to trudging through underbrush and climbing over fallen logs. But something in my enthusiasm must have been contagious because he eventually agreed, though not without extracting promises that we wouldn't stay out too long and that I would let him choose what we watched on television that evening. I packed my day pack with water bottles, granola bars, and my father's old binoculars. The weight of them around my neck felt reassuring, like carrying a piece of adult responsibility into the wilderness. I also grabbed my bright orange hunting cap, a precaution our father had drilled into us since hunting season had recently begun. The mountains during hunting season could be dangerous for anyone not wearing proper visibility gear. Tommy bundled himself in a thick fleece jacket and complained about the early hour, but I could see excitement building in his eyes as we walked down Dan's long gravel driveway. The stones crunched beneath our hiking boots, and the sound seemed amplified in the morning stillness. Dan was outside splitting wood when we arrived, his axe striking the logs with rhythmic precision that spoke of decades of practice. "You boys be careful out there," he called to us, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature. "Stay on the marked trails if you can, and if you see any hunters, make sure they see that orange hat of yours." We thanked him and set off toward the tree line, where a well-worn path disappeared into the shadows of the forest. The trees seemed to swallow us whole once we left the clearing around Dan's house. Massive trunks rose like pillars supporting a living cathedral, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor. The path we followed was clearly maintained, probably used by Dan for accessing different parts of his property. But after about half a mile, we noticed a smaller, less obvious trail branching off to our left. This secondary path was narrow and partially overgrown, as if it hadn't been used regularly in some time. Something about its mysterious nature drew me like a magnet. "Come on," I told Tommy, adjusting the strap of my binoculars. "Let's see where this goes." Tommy hesitated, studying the dim pathway that wound between closely spaced pine trees. "Are you sure we should?" Dan said to stay on the marked trails. But my 15-year-old sense of adventure had already made the decision. I was already stepping onto the narrow path, pushing aside low-hanging branches and feeling the soft pine needles compress beneath my feet. Tommy, reluctant to be left alone, followed close behind. The unmarked trail proved more challenging than the main path we had abandoned. Fallen logs blocked our way at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or crawl under obstacles that scratched at our jackets and caught on our pants. The forest grew denser as we progressed, with thick stands of pine trees creating a tunnel-like effect that seemed to muffle all sound except our own breathing and footsteps. 20 minutes into this detour, the character of the woods began to change. The well-maintained forest of Dan's property gave way to something wilder and more untamed. Underbrush grew thicker, and I noticed more dead trees standing like gray skeletons among the living ones. The very air felt different here, heavier somehow, with an underlying mustiness that suggested places where sunlight rarely penetrated. It was Tommy who first spotted the deer stand. "Look up there," he whispered, pointing toward a large oak tree about 50 yards ahead. The structure was clearly handmade, constructed from rough lumber and camouflaged with military surplus netting that had faded to a dull green-brown. It sat approximately 20 feet above the ground, accessible by wooden boards nailed directly into the tree trunk as a makeshift ladder. The stand looked recent enough to be functional, but something about it felt different from the hunting blinds I had seen on Dan's property. My curiosity overcame my caution. Despite Tommy's protests, I approached the base of the tree and began climbing the improvised ladder. The boards creaked under my weight, and I noticed that several were loose or partially rotted. When I finally reached the hunting platform, I found it empty except for an old plastic chair and some scattered cigarette butts. But it was the view from the stand that made my heart race. Through the trees, roughly 300 yards in the distance, I could make out the roof of a structure that definitely wasn't on any map of Dan's property. The building appeared to be constructed from a mixture of materials: metal roofing, wooden siding, and what looked like blue tarps covering sections where the original roof had failed. "What do you see?" Tommy called up from below, his voice tight with nervous energy. "There's a building out there," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Some kind of house or cabin." When I climbed down and described what I had seen, Tommy's face went pale. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested. "We don't know whose property that is, and we might be trespassing." But the rational part of my brain had been overwhelmed by adolescent curiosity. The presence of that mysterious structure felt like a puzzle that demanded solving. Against Tommy's better judgment, I convinced him to continue toward the building, arguing that we would just get close enough for a better look, and then turn back. The decision would prove to be the most dangerous mistake of my young life. As we approached the mysterious structure, the forest around us seemed to grow more oppressive with each step. The trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form an almost impenetrable canopy that reduced the October afternoon to perpetual twilight. Our footsteps on the pine needle carpet seemed unnaturally loud, and I found myself wincing at every small sound we made. About 100 yards from our destination, we encountered an abandoned vehicle that stopped us both in our tracks. An old Jeep Cherokee sat at an odd angle beside the path, its front end pointed toward the trees as if the driver had simply pulled off the trail and walked away. The vehicle was ancient, probably from the late 1980s, and showed extensive rust damage along its wheel wells and door frames. All four tires were flat, and kudzu vines had begun climbing over the hood and windshield. What struck me most about the abandoned Jeep was how it had gotten to this remote location in the first place. We were now at least a mile from any road accessible to vehicles, and the narrow path we had followed would have been impossible for anything larger than an ATV to navigate. Yet here sat this full-sized SUV, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Tommy ran his hand along the vehicle's dusty side panel, leaving tracks in the accumulated grime. "This thing's been here for years," he observed, his voice barely above a whisper. Beyond the abandoned Jeep, the land rose sharply in a steep embankment that we had to scramble up on hands and knees, grabbing exposed roots and small saplings for handholds. The slope was treacherous with loose rocks and crumbling soil that gave way under our feet. When we finally reached the top, breathing hard from the exertion, we found ourselves face to face with what could only generously be called a house. The structure before us was a nightmare assemblage of mismatched materials and desperate repairs. The main building appeared to have started as a small cabin, but multiple additions had been cobbled together using salvaged lumber, metal sheeting, and blue plastic tarps. Windows were completely covered with layers of newspaper and duct tape, creating an impenetrable barrier that prevented any glimpse of the interior. The front door was likewise sealed, with what appeared to be a heavy screen door secured with multiple layers of silver tape. To one side of the main structure stood a rusted playground, set that had clearly seen better decades. The swing set's chains hung at odd angles, some missing their seats entirely, while others supported swings that had rotted away to mere fragments of plastic and metal. A small slide, once painted bright red, had faded to the color of dried blood and was partially collapsed on one side. But it was the smell that truly unsettled me. A sharp, chemical odor hung in the air around the property, unlike anything I had encountered before. It wasn't the clean scent of pine trees or the earthy aroma of decomposing leaves that characterized the rest of the forest. This smell was harsh and synthetic, with an underlying sweetness that made my throat burn when I breathed too deeply. Tommy grabbed my arm, his fingernails digging into my jacket sleeve. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Right now." But teenage curiosity had transformed into something approaching obsession. I had to know what was behind those newspaper-covered windows, what was causing that strange smell, and why someone had gone to such lengths to hide their activities in the middle of the wilderness. My decision to circle around to the back of the property would haunt me for years to come. Despite Tommy's increasingly frantic pleas to return home, I felt compelled to solve the mystery of this hidden compound. The rational part of my brain whispered warnings, but the overwhelming need to understand what I was seeing drowned out all caution. Behind the main structure, the scene became even more disturbing. A small travel trailer sat on blocks about 30 yards from the house, connected to it by a series of extension cords and garden hoses that snaked across the ground like mechanical veins. The trailer was old and weather-beaten, its aluminum siding streaked with rust stains and green mold. A thin column of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney pipe that had been crudely installed through the roof. Scattered around the trailer were dozens of blue plastic barrels, the 50-gallon drums used for storing chemicals or other industrial materials. Some were empty and lying on their sides, while others appeared to be full and were connected to an elaborate network of plastic tubing and hoses. The chemical smell that had been noticeable near the main house was overwhelming here, so strong that it made my eyes water and my throat burn. An old pickup truck, possibly from the 1970s, sat near the trailer with its tailgate down. The truck bed was filled with what appeared to be bags of fertilizer, boxes of cold medicine, and other materials I couldn't immediately identify. But even my 15-year-old mind was beginning to piece together the horrifying truth of what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't just someone's remote cabin or hunting camp. This was a drug manufacturing operation, specifically designed to be hidden from law enforcement in the most remote part of the mountains. The chemical smell, the barrels, the elaborate setup of hoses and equipment, Everything pointed to the production of methamphetamine on an industrial scale. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Tommy and I weren't just trespassing on someone's property. We had wandered into the territory of dangerous criminals who would have every reason to ensure that witnesses to their operation never made it home to tell anyone what they had seen. I grabbed my binoculars and crept closer to the trailer, staying low behind the scattered barrels and equipment. Through the small windows, I could see the shadows of at least 2 people moving around inside. Their voices carried through the thin walls of the trailer, raised in what sounded like an argument about measurements and timing. My hands shook as I adjusted the focus on the binoculars, trying to get a clearer view of the operation. But it was at that moment that my bright orange hunting cap, the very safety precaution that was supposed to protect us in the woods, became the instrument of our near doom. A shout erupted from the trailer, followed by the sound of a door slamming open. Through my binoculars, I saw a large man emerge from the trailer, pointing directly at our hiding spot. He had seen the flash of orange through the trees, and our presence was no longer a secret. The man began yelling to someone inside the trailer, his words carrying clearly across the distance between us. "We got company. Kids with binoculars." The next few moments unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Tommy and I crouched behind the chemical barrels, frozen in terror as the implications of our discovery crashed over us like a wave. These weren't hunters or harmless mountain folk we had stumbled upon. These were criminals engaged in serious felonies who would view 2 teenage witnesses as an existential threat to their operation. A second man emerged from the trailer, and I could see both of them clearly now through my binoculars. The first was tall and heavy-set, with long, unkempt hair and a thick beard that had gone gray at the edges. He wore dirty overalls and heavy work boots, and his hands gestured wildly as he spoke to his companion. The second man was shorter but more wiry, with nervous energy that was visible even from our distant vantage point. What made my stomach drop to my feet was the sight of firearms. Both men were now armed, the tall one carrying what appeared to be a shotgun while his companion held a handgun. They were scanning the tree line methodically, clearly trying to locate exactly where we were hiding. "We have to run," I whispered to Tommy, my voice barely audible even to myself. "When I say go, we run back the way we came, and we don't stop." But before I could give the signal, a new element entered the terrifying tableau. The sound of barking erupted from behind the trailer, deep and aggressive. The men were releasing a dog, a large one, from the sound of its bark. Through the binoculars, I watched the tall man attach a thick chain to what appeared to be a Rottweiler or similar breed, a muscular animal that strained against its restraint with obvious eagerness to pursue us. The psychological impact of seeing that dog was overwhelming. Tommy began to hyperventilate beside me, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. I realized that our situation had moved beyond mere danger into something approaching a life-or-death scenario. These men had the advantage of knowing the terrain, they were armed, and they had a tracking dog. We were just 2 kids who had wandered far from safety into a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond our control. The decision to run came when the dog's barking grew louder and I realized the men were moving in our direction. There was no more time for planning or strategy. I grabbed Tommy's hand and we bolted from our hiding place, crashing through the underbrush with abandon. Behind us, the shouting intensified as the men spotted our movement. The voices that followed us were filled with rage and desperation. I caught fragments of their threats carried on the mountain air, promises of what they would do if they caught us, crude descriptions of how they would ensure we never told anyone what we had seen. The words were meant to terrorize, and they succeeded completely. We ran through the forest with the kind of desperate speed that only comes from mortal fear. Branches whipped at our faces and clothes, rocks turned under our feet, and roots caught at our ankles. Behind us, the sound of the dog grew steadily closer, its barking now mixed with the crashing sounds of our pursuers moving through the underbrush. The terror of being hunted by armed men and their dog transformed every shadow in the forest into a potential hiding place, and every sound into a harbinger of capture. My mind raced through possibilities as we fled, trying to remember every piece of wilderness survival knowledge I had ever absorbed from books, television shows, and conversations with experienced outdoorsmen. The key, I realized, was to break our scent trail and find concealment that would allow the search party to pass by us. Simply running would eventually lead to capture. The dog would track us relentlessly, and the men knew the terrain better than we did. We needed to disappear. About 200 yards from the drug operation, I spotted our salvation, a massive oak tree that had fallen years earlier, probably during a winter storm. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter and had created a natural barrier when it fell across a small depression in the forest floor. The space beneath the log was partially filled with accumulated leaves and debris, creating a hollow that could conceivably hide 2 small people. "This way," I hissed to Tommy, pulling him toward the fallen tree. "We're going to hide under here." Tommy's eyes were wide with panic, but he followed my lead without question. I quickly explained my plan as we approached the log. He would crawl into the depression first, pressing himself as close to the trunk as possible, and I would lie in front of him, using my body to shield him from discovery. Then we would cover ourselves with leaves and debris and remain absolutely motionless until the search party passed by. The plan required splitting up, even briefly, and that terrified me almost as much as the approaching dog. But I knew it was our only chance. I sent Tommy to hide under the log while I ran toward a nearby creek, my bright orange hunting cap clutched in my hand. At the water's edge, I hurled the hat as far as I could toward the opposite bank, hoping it would create a false trail that would lead our pursuers away from our actual hiding place. When I returned to the fallen oak, Tommy was already concealed in the depression, his small body pressed against the massive trunk. I crawled in next to him, pulling armfuls of leaves and forest debris over both of us until we were completely covered. The smell of rotting vegetation filled my nostrils, and I had to consciously control my breathing to avoid coughing or making any sound that might give away our position. We lay there in the darkness beneath our makeshift camouflage, listening to the sounds of our pursuers growing steadily closer. The dog's barking became more excited as it picked up our scent trail, and I could hear the heavy footsteps of the 2 men crashing through the underbrush. Their voices were clearer now, filled with a mixture of anger and frustration. "They can't have gone far," one of them was saying. "Kids that age can't move through this terrain that fast." "The dog's got them," replied the other voice. "Look how excited he's getting. They went this way." The sound of their approach was terrifying in its methodical nature. These weren't panicked amateurs stumbling around in the woods. They were conducting a systematic search, following the dog's nose and using their knowledge of the terrain to anticipate where we might try to hide. When they passed within 30 yards of our hiding place, I could smell cigarette smoke and hear their heavy breathing from the exertion of moving through the dense forest. But then, miraculously, the sounds began to move away from us. The dog had picked up the scent trail leading toward the creek where I had thrown my orange hat, and our pursuers were following the false lead I had created. Their voices grew fainter as they moved in the wrong direction, buying us precious time to plan our escape. We remained hidden under the fallen oak for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, listening as the sounds of our pursuers faded into the distance. When we could no longer hear any trace of the dogs barking or the men's voices, I carefully pushed aside our covering of leaves and debris and peered out into the forest around us. The woods had returned to their natural stillness, with only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow breaking the silence. But the peaceful atmosphere felt deceptive now, as if the forest itself had been contaminated by what we had witnessed. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every rustle of leaves might herald the return of our pursuers. "Are they gone?" Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from fear and the effort of remaining silent for so long. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't certain of anything anymore. "But we need to get out of here right now, and we need to be smart about it." The journey back to Dan's property became an exercise in controlled paranoia. We moved through the forest like hunted animals, freezing at every unexpected sound and taking cover behind trees whenever we heard anything that might indicate human presence. What had been an adventurous hike into the wilderness that morning had transformed into a desperate escape from people who would have no hesitation about harming us to protect their criminal enterprise. My 15-year-old mind struggled to process the full implications of what we had discovered. The drug operation we had stumbled upon represented serious organized crime, the kind of activity that attracted violent criminals who viewed murder as simply another business expense. We weren't just witnesses to illegal activity. We were loose ends that needed to be eliminated. The physical demands of our escape were made worse by the psychological trauma of being hunted. Every muscle in my body ached from the sustained tension, and my throat burned from breathing heavily during our flight through the forest. Tommy was in even worse condition, stumbling frequently and requiring constant encouragement to keep moving. When we finally emerged from the tree line near Dan's property, both of us were scratched, dirty, and emotionally drained. Dan was working in his barn when he saw us approaching, and the expression on his face told me that our ordeal was written clearly in our appearance. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said, setting down his tools and walking toward us. "What happened out there?" The temptation to tell him everything was overwhelming. Dan was an adult, someone who would know how to handle the situation and protect us from the criminals we had encountered. But the irrational fear that dominated my thinking convinced me that talking about what we had seen would only make the situation worse. What if Dan didn't believe us? What if he told our parents and they forbade us from ever going into the woods again? What if the criminals somehow learned that we had talked? "We just got turned around," I lied, hating myself for the deception but unable to see any alternative. Lost track of time and had to hurry back. Dan studied our faces for a long moment, clearly unconvinced by my explanation. But he didn't press the issue, instead offering to drive us home since we were obviously exhausted. We gratefully accepted the ride, spending the short trip in silence while my mind raced through the events of the day. The decision to keep our discovery secret would haunt me for years. Tommy and I made a pact that afternoon never to speak of what we had seen in the woods, a promise born from fear and the mistaken belief that silence would somehow protect us. We told ourselves that the criminals didn't know who we were or where we lived, that as long as we stayed away from that part of the forest, we would be safe. But the psychological impact of our encounter lingered long after the physical scratches healed. For months afterward, I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding from dreams of being chased through endless forests by armed men and vicious dogs. The woods that had once represented freedom and adventure now felt threatening and dangerous, filled with hidden perils that could destroy lives in an instant. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college and the memory had finally begun to lose some of its sharp edges, that I told my father about what Tommy and I had experienced that October afternoon. His reaction was a mixture of concern and relief. Concern that we had been in such serious danger, and relief that we had somehow managed to escape unharmed. The land where we encountered the drug operation has since been purchased by developers and cleared for a housing subdivision. Sometimes I wonder if the construction crews found any evidence of the criminal activity that once flourished in those remote woods, or if the forest simply reclaimed the site and erased all traces of what we had witnessed. The experience taught me that the wilderness, for all its beauty and majesty, can harbor dangers that have nothing to do with wild animals or natural hazards. The most dangerous predators in the mountains walk on two legs and have no connection to the natural world beyond their desire to exploit its remoteness for criminal purposes. I still love hiking and spending time outdoors, but I approach the wilderness with a different kind of respect now. The mountains showed me something that day that most people never see, a glimpse into the darker side of human nature, and the realization that evil can flourish anywhere, even in the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places on Earth. The memory of that October afternoon serves as a permanent reminder that adventure always carries risk, and that sometimes the price of curiosity can be higher than anyone should have to pay. Tommy and I were lucky that day, lucky that we were smart enough to hide, lucky that our pursuers followed a false trail, and lucky that we made it home safely. Not everyone who stumbles upon such secrets in the wilderness is so fortunate. Five years ago, during the summer of 2020, I found myself planning an escape from the monotony of everyday life. The pandemic had forced most of us into isolation, and I was desperate for an adventure once travel restrictions began to ease. My longtime friends, Jack, David, and William, were equally eager to reconnect with nature after months of confinement. We settled on a 2-week expedition to the boundary waters that stretch between Minnesota and Canada, a vast labyrinth of interconnected lakes that represent the pinnacle of wilderness canoeing. At 28, I considered myself reasonably experienced in outdoor activities. I'd spent many weekends hiking various trails and had completed several shorter camping trips, but nothing quite as ambitious as what we were planning. The Boundary Waters aren't your typical camping destination. They comprise thousands of pristine lakes spanning over 1 million acres of remote wilderness. The area is so isolated that in many spots you can paddle for days without encountering another human being. Our preparation was extensive. We purchased topographical maps, high-quality camping gear, fishing equipment, and emergency supplies. We invested in a satellite phone, an expense that seemed excessive at the time but would later prove invaluable. The plan was straightforward yet flexible. We would canoe from lake to lake, fish for our meals, and immerse ourselves in the untamed beauty of one of North America's last true wildernesses. We arranged for a helicopter pickup service that would retrieve us whenever we decided our adventure had reached its conclusion. "Remember," David said during our final planning session, "we need to be prepared for anything. Weather changes rapidly up there, and help is hours, sometimes days away." None of us fully comprehended the weight of his words at the time. We were too excited about the prospect of disconnecting from society and reconnecting with each other. Our conversations were filled with anticipation about the fishing, the campfire stories, and the stargazing opportunities. We discussed potential routes, but ultimately decided against a rigid itinerary. The freedom to explore at our own pace was, after all, part of the appeal. The night before our departure, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet my thoughts. There was excitement, certainly, but also an inexplicable uneasiness that I couldn't quite place. I dismissed it as pre-adventure jitters and forced myself to close my eyes, knowing that the journey ahead would demand my full energy and attention. We arrived at our entry point on a bright Monday morning. The outfitter who dropped us off gave us a final rundown of safety protocols and weather patterns before wishing us luck. As his truck disappeared down the dirt road, leaving behind only a cloud of dust, the four of us stood at the edge of the first lake, taking in the vastness that stretched before us. "This is it," Jack said, adjusting his backpack. "No turning back now." The first few days unfolded exactly as we had hoped. We established a comfortable routine. Wake at dawn, break camp, paddle until midday, fish for lunch, continue to our next destination, set up camp, fish for dinner, and end the day with stories around a campfire. The lakes were as spectacular as promised, crystal clear waters reflecting the endless blue sky, surrounded by dense forests of pine and birch. Occasionally, we'd spot wildlife, a soaring eagle, a curious otter, or a moose wading in the shallows. By the fourth day, we had settled into the rhythm of wilderness living. The concerns of everyday life seemed increasingly distant, replaced by more immediate considerations: the weather, our food supply, the next campsite. We documented our journey in a shared journal, taking turns recording the day's events and observations. "I haven't felt this relaxed in years," William remarked one evening as we sat around the campfire, our bellies full of freshly caught walleye. "It's like the outside world doesn't exist anymore." I nodded in agreement, though something about his statement lingered in my mind. The isolation, while rejuvenating, also meant vulnerability. We were entirely dependent on ourselves and each other. If something went wrong, help would not be immediately available. The thought was fleeting, quickly chased away by the camaraderie and the simple pleasures of the moment. We stayed up late that night, watching the northern lights dance across the sky in brilliant shades of green and purple, a natural spectacle that seemed to validate our decision to venture this far from civilization. By the end of the first week, we had covered considerable distance, navigating through a series of smaller lakes connected by narrow channels. The weather had been remarkably cooperative, sunny days with mild temperatures and gentle breezes. That changed on our 8th day. We started the morning with plans to reach Lake Insula, one of the larger bodies of water in the area. The journey would involve several hours of paddling, but we had grown confident in our abilities and were eager to explore new territory. About an hour into our journey, while traversing a long, narrow lake, David noticed a change in the atmosphere. "Look at the horizon," he said, pointing northwest. Dark clouds were gathering in the distance, advancing rapidly in our direction. The wind, which had been a gentle companion, suddenly picked up, creating ripples across the previously calm water surface. "We need to find shelter," Jack urged. "Those clouds don't look friendly." We hastened our paddling, searching for a suitable landing spot along the shoreline. The waves were growing with each passing minute, and our canoes, sturdy as they were, weren't designed to handle rough waters. William pulled out his binoculars and confirmed our fears. "The waves ahead are at least 2 feet high and growing," he reported grimly. "We can't proceed." About 20 minutes later, we spotted a small clearing on the eastern shore. It wasn't ideal. The terrain was rocky and slightly elevated, but it offered better protection than continuing on the increasingly turbulent lake. With coordinated effort, we navigated our canoes toward the clearing. The landing was precarious. The waves pushed against our vessels, threatening to capsize them as we approached the shore. Through careful maneuvering and sheer determination, we managed to beach the canoes and quickly unload our essential gear. "Set up the tents first," I shouted over the howling wind. "We need shelter before everything gets soaked." Working together with practiced efficiency, we erected our tents in record time, securing them with extra stakes to withstand the impending storm. Just as we finished tying down the last tent, the rain began. Not a gentle drizzle, but a sudden downpour that seemed to transform day into night. We retreated into our tents, 2 to each, listening to the tempest rage outside. Thunder boomed overhead, followed by flashes of lightning that illuminated our shelters in brief, eerie bursts. The wind tested the resilience of our equipment, causing the tent fabric to flap violently. "Well, this is certainly an adventure now," David attempted to joke from the adjacent tent, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Inside my tent, Jack and I laid out our sleeping bags on the ground sheet, creating a barrier against the moisture that had started to seep through the floor despite the tent's waterproof claims. We arranged our packs to form makeshift pillows and settled in for what promised to be a long, uncomfortable night. "Do you think it'll pass by morning?" Jack asked, his usually confident voice tinged with concern. "Let's hope so," I replied, though the intensity of the storm suggested otherwise. "At least we're not out on the water." As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The temperature dropped considerably, adding to our discomfort. We huddled in our sleeping bags, trying to conserve warmth. Sleep was practically impossible with the constant bombardment of noise. The rustling of tent fabric, the pounding of rain, the cracking of thunder, and occasionally, the unsettling sound of branches breaking in the surrounding forest. Throughout the night, I drifted in and out of consciousness, awoken repeatedly by particularly loud thunderclaps, or when the wind threatened to uproot our temporary shelter. In those moments of wakefulness, strange thoughts crept into my mind. I found myself wondering about other campers in the area, whether they had found adequate shelter or were battling the elements as we were. I thought about the vastness of the wilderness around us, how small and insignificant we were in comparison. Most disturbingly, I found myself contemplating what would happen if the storm didn't pass. If we were stranded here for days, our supplies dwindling, the satellite phone potentially damaged by water. When morning finally arrived, It brought with it a welcome reprieve. The rain had reduced to a light drizzle, and the wind had calmed considerably. Emerging from our tents, we surveyed the aftermath. Our campsite had weathered the storm relatively well, though everything was sodden. The surrounding area bore evidence of the night's fury: fallen branches, puddles of water, and debris scattered across the ground. "Well, that was something," William said, stretching his stiff limbs. "Everyone okay?" We nodded, relieved to have made it through without major incident. The lake, which had been so threatening the previous day, now appeared almost serene, though the water level had visibly risen. "Let's assess the damage and dry out what we can," I suggested. "Then we can decide on our next move." With the storm behind us and the sun gradually breaking through the clouds, our spirits lifted. We spent the morning drying our equipment and clothes, hanging them on nearby branches to catch the increasing sunlight. Despite the previous night's discomfort, the conversation was optimistic as we discussed our plans for the day. "I'm thinking we skip the long paddle for today," I said, laying out a map on a relatively dry patch of ground. "Let's fish this lake, get some fresh food, and maybe explore the immediate area on foot." The others agreed readily. None of us were particularly eager to get back on the water so soon after the storm. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal, one of the few food items that hadn't been affected by the rain, we gathered our fishing gear and set off along the shoreline. The forest was alive with post-storm activity. Birds called energetically to one another, small animals rustled through the underbrush, and water dripped from the canopy above, creating a continuous ambient soundtrack. We walked in companionable silence, taking in the sights and sounds, occasionally stopping to inspect interesting flora or fauna. "I wonder if the storm drove the fish deeper," Jack mused as we navigated around a fallen tree. "Might be harder to catch anything today." "Only one way to find out," David replied, patting his tackle box. We had been walking for approximately half a mile when William, who was leading the group, suddenly stopped. His posture stiffened, and he raised a hand to signal us to halt. "What is it?" I asked, moving to stand beside him. When I saw what had caught his attention, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Ahead of us, partially obscured by the trees, was another campsite. Unlike our hastily established storm shelter, this one appeared to be a proper setup, or at least it had been. Now it was in a state of complete disarray. Cautiously, we approached the site. The scene that greeted us was disturbing on multiple levels. Several tents lay collapsed and torn, their contents spilled across the ground. Personal belongings, clothing, backpacks, cooking utensils, were scattered haphazardly as if thrown in panic. A fire pit in the center of the clearing contained the cold, sodden remains of what must have been a decent-sized campfire. "What happened here?" Jack whispered, his voice tense. None of us had an answer. We moved through the site slowly, taking in the details with growing concern. The most striking aspect was the presence of almost all the camping essentials: canoes secured on the shore, food supplies, though many containers were ripped open, clothing, and gear. It appeared as though whoever had been camping here had left in extreme haste, abandoning valuable equipment in the process. "Look at this," David called from near one of the larger trees. He was pointing upward, where a food bag hung suspended from a high branch, at least 20 to 25 feet above the ground. The bag had been torn open, its contents now feeding the forest floor. "That's strange," I remarked, examining the setup. "They hoisted their food properly to keep it from bears, but how did it get torn open at that height?" William finished my thought. "No ordinary black bear could reach that, even if it climbed the tree." The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but present in all our minds. If a bear hadn't done this, what had? We continued our investigation, the fishing trip completely forgotten. Among the scattered belongings, we found a weather-resistant journal, its pages damp but mostly legible. The entries detailed a trip similar to ours, 3 people, all male, planning to spend 10 days exploring the boundary waters. The final entry was dated just 2 days prior to our discovery. Weather turning bad, I read aloud. Securing camp for the night. Heard strange noises in the forest earlier. Rick thinks it's just wildlife, but Ben isn't convinced. I'm setting extra precautions tonight just in case. The entry ended there, providing no clue as to what had transpired afterward, or why the campsite now lay in ruins. Should we call this in? Jack asked, gesturing to the satellite phone secured in a waterproof case on his belt. I think we should, I agreed. Something serious happened here, and whoever was camping might need help. David made the call using our satellite phone, connecting to the helicopter service we had contracted for our eventual extraction. The conversation was hampered by intermittent static, but he managed to convey the essential details. Our location and the discovery of an abandoned campsite in disarray. They say they haven't received any distress calls or reports of missing hikers in this area, David informed us after ending the call. They're checking with local authorities to see if anyone's been reported missing, but for now, they're advising us to continue our trip as planned. The response felt inadequate given what we were looking at. 3 people had clearly left this campsite in a hurry, abandoning valuable equipment and possibly their only means of transportation. The canoes still secured to the shore. Their disappearance had apparently gone unreported, which suggested either they had managed to reach civilization by some other means, or no one yet realized they were missing. I don't like this, William said, voicing the sentiment we all shared. Something feels wrong. We spent the next hour methodically searching the campsite and its immediate surroundings for any clue that might explain what had happened. The ground, still soft from the previous night's rain, held numerous footprints, some clearly human, others less distinct. Several sets of human prints led from the tents toward the forest line, suggesting a hasty departure in that direction. These look like they were made in a hurry, Jack observed, crouching to examine the impressions. Look at the depth and spacing. Whoever made these was running. Running from what, though? I asked, scanning the tree line with newfound apprehension. We followed the footprints into the forest for about 50 yards before they became indistinct on the harder ground beneath the canopy. The trail effectively went cold, leaving us with more questions than answers. Returning to the campsite, we debated our next course of action. The discovery had cast a shadow over our trip, introducing an element of unease that hadn't existed before. Even the forest around us, which had seemed so welcoming just hours earlier, now took on a more sinister aspect. We have 2 options, I said, trying to maintain a level head. We can pack up our camp and move to a different location, putting some distance between us and whatever happened here. Or we can head back the way we came and cut the trip short. I vote we move, David said after a moment's consideration. I'm not ready to end the trip, but I don't want to stay near this place either. Jack and William nodded in agreement. None of us were willing to admit defeat, but the abandoned campsite had undeniably affected our sense of security. By mutual consensus, we decided to return to our temporary camp, gather our belongings, and paddle to a new location before nightfall. As we prepared to leave the abandoned site, I felt compelled to document it. Using the waterproof camera we had brought for the trip, I took several photographs of the scene. The torn tents, the scattered belongings, the hoisted food bag. Something told me these images might be important later, though for what purpose, I couldn't say. We left the site exactly as we had found it, in case the authorities needed to investigate. The walk back to our camp was notably different from our earlier trek. Where before we had moved with ease, enjoying the post-storm freshness, now we proceeded with caution, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest, ears attuned to every sound. The wilderness, once a source of joy and rejuvenation, had revealed its potential for mystery and danger. We returned to our campsite and immediately began breaking it down, working with efficient urgency born of our shared unease. The tents came down quickly, followed by the careful packing of our gear into waterproof bags. Within an hour, we were loading the canoes, eager to put distance between ourselves and the disturbing discovery we had made. "Where to?" Jack asked as we pushed off from the shore, the afternoon sun still high enough to give us several hours of paddling time. "Let's head east," I suggested, consulting the map. "There's a smaller lake about 2 hours from here with several islands. We can set up camp on one of them." The logic behind my suggestion wasn't stated but understood by all. An island would provide greater visibility and security, with water serving as a natural barrier on all sides. The others nodded in agreement, and we set our course accordingly. The paddle was strenuous, partly due to the lingering effects of the storm on the water conditions, and partly because of our collective desire to reach our destination quickly. Conversation was minimal, each of us lost in our thoughts about what we had witnessed. Around mid-afternoon, we reached the channel that would lead us to the smaller lake. The passage was narrow, flanked by steep rock faces on both sides, creating a natural corridor through which water flowed at a slightly increased rate. Navigating it required concentration and coordination between the pairs in each canoe. As we emerged from the channel into the open water of the new lake, a sense of relief washed over me. The lake was as I had hoped, smaller than the one we had left behind, but still substantial, with several tree-covered islands dotting its surface. We made for the largest of these, located roughly in the center of the lake. Upon reaching the island, we discovered it was an ideal campsite, elevated enough to provide good drainage, with a natural clearing surrounded by tall pines that would offer shelter from the wind. Most importantly, it offered clear visibility in all directions, a feature that now seemed more valuable than ever. We established our new camp with methodical precision, setting up the tents, organizing our gear, and preparing a central fire pit. By the time the sun began to set, we had created a semblance of normalcy and security. Yet beneath the routine actions, I could sense a new vigilance in all of us. David positioned his tent to face the water, providing a view of any approach. William arranged our canoes with unusual care, ensuring they could be quickly accessed if needed. Jack took inventory of our supplies, paying particular attention to our emergency equipment. As darkness fell, we gathered around the newly lit campfire, the flames casting long shadows across the clearing. The warmth and light provided some comfort, but the conversation inevitably returned to what we had discovered earlier that day. "What do you think happened to them?" William asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "Maybe they just got spooked by the storm and decided to hike out," Jack offered, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe his own explanation. "And leave everything behind, including their canoes?" David countered. "That doesn't make sense. The nearest road or settlement has to be at least 20 miles from here." I remained silent, considering the journal entry I had read. The mention of strange noises and extra precautions suggested that whatever had prompted their departure had been building before the storm hit. It wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by bad weather. "Could it have been a bear?" William suggested. "Maybe they heard one approaching and panicked." "Possible," I conceded, "but unlikely. Experienced campers would know that making noise usually scares bears away, and they wouldn't abandon their camp entirely. They'd wait it out somewhere nearby and return when it was safe." A heavy silence settled over us as we contemplated the implications. Something had frightened 3 experienced outdoorsmen enough to make them flee into the forest in the middle of the night, leaving behind essential equipment and their primary means of transportation. Whatever it was, it had been sufficient to override their training and instincts for wilderness survival. As the night deepened, our conversation dwindled, replaced by the sounds of the forest around us. The gentle lapping of water against the shore, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional call of a nocturnal bird. Under normal circumstances, these sounds would have been soothing, a natural lullaby against which to fall asleep. Now they served as a constant reminder of our isolation and vulnerability. We established a watch rotation for the night, something we hadn't deemed necessary earlier in our trip. 2 hours each, rotating through all 4 of us. ensuring that someone was always awake and alert. It was a precaution born of unease rather than any specific threat, but it provided a measure of comfort nonetheless. My watch came third in the rotation, from midnight to 2 a.m. When Jack woke me for my shift, I could see the weariness in his expression, not just from lack of sleep, but from the strain of heightened vigilance. "Anything?" I asked quietly, sitting up in my sleeping bag. He shook his head. "Nothing unusual. Just the usual forest sounds." I nodded, grateful for the uneventful report, and moved to take his place by the dying embers of the fire. Jack retreated to his tent, leaving me alone with the night. The first hour of my watch passed slowly. I maintained the fire at a low burn, providing just enough light to monitor the immediate surroundings without compromising my night vision. Every so often, I would walk the perimeter of our camp, scanning the water and the tree line for any sign of movement or disturbance. It was during one such patrol, approximately an hour into my watch, that I first noticed it, a faint sound coming from the mainland to the north of our island. Initially, I dismissed it as wind through the trees or an animal moving through the underbrush, but as I listened more intently, the sound became more distinct. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical in its consistency. Instinctively, I reached for the high-powered flashlight we kept for emergencies. Pointing it toward the source of the sound, I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the tree line on the mainland. A flicker of movement, a disruption in the natural pattern of shadows. But when I focused the beam directly on that spot, there was nothing there. I remained frozen, flashlight trained on the tree line, straining to see or hear anything definitive. The rhythmic sound had stopped the moment I switched on the light. Now, there was only silence, more complete and oppressive than before. After several minutes of watching and listening, I convinced myself that it had been nothing more than my imagination, heightened by the events of the day and the general atmosphere of unease. I returned to the fire, but the sense of being observed lingered, an itch at the back of my neck that refused to subside. When William emerged from his tent to relieve me at 2 a.m., I debated whether to mention what I had heard. In the end, I decided against it. Without concrete evidence, I would only be adding to the collective anxiety. Instead, I briefed him on the uneventful aspects of my watch and returned to my tent, hoping for a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. But sleep, when it came, was fitful and disturbed by fragmented dreams, running through endless forests, pursuing or being pursued by unseen entities, the sound of tearing fabric and splintering wood echoing through the dreamscape. I woke several times, momentarily disoriented, before the reality of our situation came flooding back. Dawn arrived with a mist hanging over the lake, reducing visibility and adding to the general sense of isolation. We emerged from our tents one by one, bleary-eyed and subdued. The watches had taken their toll, disrupting our sleep patterns and leaving us fatigued. "Coffee first, then we talk," David declared, setting up the portable stove to boil water. We sat in a tight circle, cups of steaming instant coffee in hand, the warming beverage doing little to dispel the chill that had settled into our bones. A chill that had less to do with the morning temperature and more with our mental state. "Did anyone hear anything unusual during their watch?" William asked, breaking the silence. Jack and David shook their heads. I hesitated, then decided to share what I had experienced. "I heard something during my shift," I admitted. "A rhythmic sound coming from the mainland to the north. When I shined the flashlight in that direction, it stopped. And I thought I saw movement in the tree line, but I couldn't be sure." The revelation was met with concerned glances. No one dismissed my account or suggested it was merely my imagination, which in itself was telling. We had all been affected by the discovery of the abandoned campsite. Our collective perception shifted toward hypervigilance. "I think we need to make a decision," I continued. "Do we continue the trip as planned, or do we call for an early extraction?" The question hung in the air, carrying the weight of our shared unease. We had invested significant time, money, and emotional energy in this adventure. Cutting it short felt like an admission of defeat, a capitulation to fear rather than a rational response to danger. Yet the evidence we had encountered, the abandoned camp, the inexplicable flight of its occupants, the strange sounds in the night, suggested that caution might be the wiser course. "I vote we call it," William said finally. "Whatever happened to those guys, I don't want it happening to us. We've had a good week out here. Let's not push our luck." Jack nodded in agreement. "As much as I hate to end early, I haven't felt right since we found that camp. I'm constantly on edge, expecting something to happen. That's not what this trip was supposed to be about." David was the last to weigh in. He had been the most enthusiastic about the expedition from the beginning, the one who had suggested the Boundary Waters as our destination. His reluctance to abandon the adventure was evident in his expression, but eventually he too nodded. "Safety first," he conceded. "If we're all this unsettled, we're not going to enjoy the rest of the trip anyway. Let's call for extraction tomorrow morning. That gives us one more day out here, and we can use it to paddle closer to one of the designated pickup points." With the decision made, a subtle shift occurred in our collective mood. The pressure of uncertainty was replaced by the practicalities of planning our exit. We studied the maps, identifying the nearest extraction point where a helicopter could land safely. It was a clearing on the western shore of a larger lake, approximately a 6-hour paddle from our current position. "If we leave after breakfast tomorrow, we should reach the extraction point by mid-afternoon," I calculated. "Then we can set up camp and be ready for pickup the following morning." The plan was sound and provided a clear structure for our remaining time in the wilderness. Yet as we went about our day, fishing for our meals, maintaining the camp, preparing for the following day's journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Every rustle in the underbrush, every call of a bird, every ripple on the water's surface seemed to carry a message, a warning that I couldn't quite decipher. That night, we again established a watch rotation, though with the decision to leave, the purpose was as much psychological as practical. Having someone awake and alert provided comfort to those trying to sleep, a human sentinel against the unknown. My shift came second this time, from 10 p.m. to midnight. Jack handed over the watch with a whispered, "All quiet," before retreating to his tent. I settled by the fire, adding a few small logs to maintain a steady flame. The night was clear, the mist of the morning having dissipated completely, leaving a canvas of stars overhead. For the first hour of my watch, the only sounds were those typical of a forest at night. The soft hooting of an owl, the distant splash of a fish jumping in the lake, the gentle creaking of tree branches in the light breeze. I had almost convinced myself that the previous night's experience had been a product of an overactive imagination when I heard it again. The rhythmic sound, clearer now than before, emanating from the same direction as the previous night. It was a repeated pattern, 3 rapid successions followed by a pause, then repeated. It reminded me of Morse code, though it followed no pattern I recognized. This time, I didn't immediately reach for the flashlight. Instead, I moved quietly to wake David, whose tent was closest to my position. "Listen," I whispered when he was fully alert. He cocked his head, focusing on the sounds of the night. When the rhythmic pattern began again, his eyes widened slightly, confirming that it wasn't just in my head. "Wake the others," he whispered back, quietly. Within minutes, all 4 of us were awake and alert, listening intently to the mysterious sound. It continued at regular intervals, neither approaching nor receding, maintaining its position somewhere in the mainland forest. "What do you think it is?" William asked, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's the same sound I heard last night, and it's coming from the same direction." "Could it be another camper?" Jack suggested. "Maybe sending a signal or using some kind of equipment?" "At this hour?" In this location? David countered skeptically. We haven't seen any signs of other campers for days, and this area is pretty remote. The discussion might have continued if not for what happened next. The rhythmic sound suddenly ceased, replaced by a different noise, a sustained low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath our feet. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, neither animal nor machine, yet somehow reminiscent of both. We stood frozen, listening as the rumble persisted for several long seconds before gradually fading away. In its wake, an unnatural silence descended, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Call for extraction now," William said, his voice tight with suppressed fear. "I don't want to wait until morning." None of us argued. The satellite phone was retrieved from its waterproof case, and David made the call, explaining our change of plans and requesting the earliest possible pickup. There was a brief discussion about night extraction risks, but ultimately the helicopter service agreed to dispatch a pilot at first light, approximately 5 hours from our call. "They're coming at dawn," David reported after ending the call. "We need to be ready to move to the extraction point as soon as there's enough light to navigate safely." The remainder of the night was spent in a state of tense readiness. We packed our essential gear, leaving only what we would need for a quick breakfast and the short journey to the extraction point. No one suggested returning to sleep. The prospect seemed absurd, given the circumstances. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. We maintained a larger fire than usual, finding comfort in its light and warmth. The mysterious sounds did not return, but their absence provided little reassurance. If anything, the silence felt expectant, as if the forest was waiting for something to occur. The first hint of dawn appeared as a faint lightening of the eastern sky, a gradual transition from black to deep blue. We had been awake for hours, our nerves frayed by the night's events and the anticipation of departure. The moment there was sufficient light to navigate safely, we loaded our gear into the canoes and pushed off from the island's shore. The morning mist had returned, creating an ethereal landscape of half-seen shapes and muted sounds. We paddled in tight formation, each canoe within arm's reach of the other, taking comfort in our proximity. The extraction point was closer than we had initially planned, a small clearing on the eastern shore of our current lake, chosen for its accessibility and the relative flatness of the terrain. We reached it just as the sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, casting long shadows across the water. The clearing was as described by the helicopter service, a natural opening in the forest with enough space for a small aircraft to land safely. We beached our canoes and unloaded our gear, setting up a temporary camp to await our rescue. The satellite phone buzzed with a message from the pilot, confirming they were en route and approximately 30 minutes from our location. The news brought a palpable sense of relief, a confirmation that our ordeal was nearing its end. As we waited, we discussed what to do about the abandoned campsite we had discovered. The consensus was to report it to the park authorities once we returned to civilization, providing the photographs I had taken and our best estimate of its location. It seemed important somehow to ensure that someone looked into the fate of those 3 campers, even if our direct involvement was coming to an end. The sound of the approaching helicopter reached us before we could see it, a distant thudding that gradually increased in volume. Then suddenly, it appeared through a gap in the tree canopy, a bright yellow machine that represented safety and a return to the world we knew. The pilot sat down in the clearing with practiced ease, the downdraft from the rotors creating a mini whirlwind of leaves and pine needles. After a brief exchange with the crew, we loaded our gear into the storage compartment and climbed aboard, securing ourselves in the seats provided. As the helicopter lifted off, I gazed down at the wilderness below, the vast network of lakes and forests that had been our home for the past week. From this vantage point, it looked peaceful, benign even. It was hard to reconcile the beauty with the sense of dread that had prompted our early departure. The journey back to civilization was largely silent, each of us lost in our thoughts about what we had experienced. The relief of rescue was tempered by a lingering unease, a sense that we were carrying something back with us from the wilderness. Not a physical artifact, but a question that had no clear answer. Upon our return, we reported the abandoned campsite to the park authorities as planned. They took our statements and the photographs, promising to investigate. A week later, we received a follow-up call informing us that they had located the site based on our description, but there was no sign of the missing campers. A search of the surrounding area had yielded no results, and without a formal missing persons report, there was little more they could do. In the months that followed, I occasionally checked news sources for any reports of hikers or campers gone missing in the Boundary Waters. Nothing that matched our experience ever surfaced. It was as if those 3 men had simply vanished, leaving behind only the disrupted camp as evidence of their existence. The 4 of us, Jack, David, William, and I, remained friends, but we never again discussed a return to the Boundary Waters. Our subsequent outdoor adventures took us to different locations, ones with more human presence and less isolation. The unspoken agreement seemed to be that while we couldn't explain what had happened, we had no desire to risk encountering it again. To this day, 5 years later, I find myself thinking about that abandoned campsite and the events that followed. The rhythmic sounds in the night, the rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, the oppressive silence that descended afterward, all elements of an experience that defies conventional explanation. I've considered various theories over the years. Perhaps it was indeed a bear attack, albeit one with unusual circumstances. Maybe the campers encountered hostile individuals in the wilderness, though the remoteness of the location makes this unlikely. Natural phenomena, sudden flooding, unexpected quicksand, or some geological event might explain their disappearance, but not the state of the camp or the sounds we heard. In my darkest moments, usually when sleep proves elusive in the early hours of the morning, I contemplate more disturbing possibilities. What if there's something in those remote forests that remains unknown to modern science? Not a supernatural entity, I've never been inclined toward such beliefs, but perhaps an animal or natural phenomenon that has yet to be documented or understood. Whatever the truth, the experience left an indelible mark on me. I still enjoy outdoor activities, still find solace in nature's beauty, but always with a heightened awareness of its potential dangers. The boundary between wilderness and civilization, once so clear in my mind, now seems more permeable, more complex. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson from our truncated adventure, a newfound respect for the unknowable aspects of the natural world, an acknowledgement that despite our maps, our GPS devices, our satellite phones, and our carefully crafted gear, there are still mysteries in the wild places of this earth. And sometimes, wisdom lies not in solving those mysteries, but in recognizing when to withdraw, when to acknowledge the limits of our understanding and control. The abandoned campsite remains, in my memory, a testament to this wisdom, a reminder that in the vast wilderness it is we who are the visitors, the transient presence. The forest was there long before we arrived, and it will remain long after we depart, harboring its secrets with patient indifference to our fleeting curiosity and fear. I decided to take that camping trip on a whim. After months of grinding away at my accounting job, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred, I needed something different. The walls of my apartment felt like they were inching closer each day, and my mind kept drifting toward memories of fresh air and open spaces. "You should take some time off," Javier from the office had suggested when he caught me staring blankly at my monitor for the 3rd time that afternoon. "Clear your head before you burn out completely." His words lingered as I scrolled through photos on my phone that evening. Snapshots from previous outdoor excursions, moments when I'd felt truly alive. One image caught my attention. A small clearing I'd discovered during a group hike last October. Unlike the popular campgrounds with their designated fire pits and nearby restrooms, this spot remained untouched, hidden away from well-trodden paths. The next morning, I requested a week off work. My supervisor, noticing the exhaustion etched on my face, approved it without hesitation. "You haven't taken a proper break in 18 months, she reminded me. "We'll manage without you." I spent the following days gathering supplies. My camping gear had collected dust in the storage closet, but everything remained serviceable. I purchased additional provisions, packed my hiking boots, and plotted a route on my topographical map. The clearing wasn't marked on any official trail guides, a detail that added to its appeal. September was ending, and forecasts predicted mild temperatures with minimal chance of precipitation. Perfect conditions for a solo retreat. I told myself this repeatedly as I loaded my vehicle, silencing the small voice questioning the wisdom of heading into remote wilderness alone. Just a weekend, I assured myself as I locked my apartment door. A quiet, uneventful weekend to reset. The drive took nearly 4 hours. As the urban landscape gave way to increasingly dense forest, my shoulders gradually lowered from their perpetual position near my ears. By the time I parked at the small, unmarked trailhead, the constant tension headache that had become my companion had begun to recede. The hike-in took longer than I'd anticipated. My memory of the route proved less reliable than I'd hoped, and twice I backtracked after recognizing I'd veered off course. The weight of my pack grew heavier with each redirected step, but when I finally pushed through a dense thicket of underbrush and emerged into the clearing, all fatigue momentarily vanished. It looked exactly as I remembered, a perfect oval of open space, perhaps 60 feet across at its widest point, ringed by towering maples and oaks, whose leaves had begun their seasonal transformation. Dappled sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns across the forest floor. The air smelled of earth and decay, not unpleasant, but rich and vital. I shrugged off my pack and took several deep breaths. The silence felt profound after months of constant noise. Traffic, office chatter, the perpetual hum of electronics. Here, the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls only emphasized the underlying quiet. "This is what I needed," I said aloud, my voice sounding strangely intrusive. I spent the remainder of daylight setting up camp with methodical precision. The tent went up easily despite months of disuse. I gathered fallen branches for firewood, taking care to collect only what had already detached from living trees. A small fire pit of stones created a focal point for the evening ahead. As dusk approached, I prepared a simple meal on my portable stove, savoring each bite as though it were gourmet cuisine. The coffee I brewed afterward tasted better than any overpriced cafe offering I'd consumed in recent memory. Night fell gradually, then all at once. Stars appeared in the gaps between branches overhead, more visible than I'd seen in years. I maintained a modest fire, mesmerized by the dancing flames, feeling the day's journey in my muscles. That first night passed without incident. I slept deeply, awakening only once to add another log to the dying embers before returning to my sleeping bag. If anything unusual occurred during those dark hours, I remained blissfully unaware. Morning arrived with gentle persistence. Birdsong pulled me from slumber, and I emerged from my tent to find the clearing bathed in soft golden light. Breakfast consisted of instant oatmeal and more coffee, consumed while seated on a fallen log that served as a natural bench. I had no specific plans for the day ahead, the absence of scheduled activities being the primary luxury of this escape. Perhaps I would explore the surrounding woods, or simply read the paperback thriller I'd brought along. The lack of urgency felt deliciously indulgent. In retrospect, that morning represented the final moments of normalcy I would experience for a very long time. Had I known what awaited me beyond the perimeter of that serene clearing, I would have packed up immediately and returned to the safety of my mundane existence. But ignorance granted me a few more hours of peace before everything changed. The second day began innocuously enough. I woke refreshed, stretched my limbs in the crisp morning air, and set about making breakfast with the contented motions of someone temporarily liberated from daily constraints. The forest seemed welcoming. Birds called from the canopy, squirrels darted between trees, and sunlight spilled through gaps in the foliage, warming the cool ground. Yet something subtle had shifted. I couldn't identify precisely what felt different, but an inexplicable unease settled over me as I sipped my morning coffee. My gaze kept drifting to the tree lines surrounding the clearing, scanning the spaces between trunks as if expecting to glimpse something watching. Nothing appeared, but the sensation persisted. Just adjusting to the solitude, I murmured, trying to rationalize the feeling. Living in a constant state of connectivity had likely atrophied my ability to be truly alone. After washing my breakfast utensils, I decided a walk might settle my nerves. The surrounding forest had numerous game trails that meandered through the underbrush. Nothing officially maintained, but passable enough for careful hiking. I packed a small day pack with water, energy bars, and a basic first aid kit, then selected a direction that seemed promising. The first hour passed pleasantly. The terrain undulated gently, occasionally revealing glimpses of distant ridgelines through breaks in the trees. I identified various plant species from half-remembered nature guides. Jack-in-the-pulpit nestled near the base of a rotting stump, clusters of mayapple spreading their umbrella-like leaves across the forest floor. Despite being early autumn, wildflowers still dotted open patches where sunlight penetrated the canopy. Gradually, however, the character of the forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks darker and more gnarled. The underbrush thinned until the ground appeared surprisingly bare, covered primarily with a thick carpet of decaying leaves. The natural sounds that had accompanied my walk, birdsong, rustling foliage, the occasional scurrying of small animals, diminished until I realized I'd been walking in near-complete silence for some time. I hadn't consciously chosen this path. My feet seemed to move of their own accord, drawing me deeper into an increasingly somber section of woodland. A rational part of my mind suggested turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward, one step after another. The air grew noticeably cooler. Despite the mild autumn day, my breath suddenly formed visible clouds before my face. Goosebumps rose along my arms beneath my jacket sleeves, and I found myself wrapping my arms around my torso, seeking warmth. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered, watching my words materialize as vapor in the unnaturally cold air. That's when I saw it. The rectangular slab lying on the forest floor ahead, partially obscured by fallen leaves yet unmistakably artificial. At first glance, it resembled a fallen headstone, though no cemetery existed for miles in any direction. As I approached cautiously, other details became apparent. Its surface gleamed with an oily iridescence despite the dim light, and not a single leaf adhered to its perfectly smooth face, as though some invisible force continuously repelled debris. Logic dictated that this was simply an abandoned piece of construction material, perhaps granite or marble from a long-forgotten building project. Yet its presence felt deliberate, positioned with purpose, rather than discarded haphazardly. Standing before it, I experienced an overwhelming certainty that this object had no business being here, and moreover, that I had no business discovering it. I knelt to examine it more closely, careful not to make direct contact. The slab measured approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, with perfectly squared edges and a thickness of perhaps 4 inches. Its composition defied easy categorization, not quite stone, not quite metal, with a surface that seemed simultaneously solid and slightly fluid, like oil suspended in a permanent state of tension. Against my better judgment, I extended a trembling hand toward its surface. The air directly above the slab felt dense, almost gelatinous, creating resistance against my approaching fingers. Inches away from contact, a jolt of something like static electricity snapped between my skin and the object, causing me to recoil immediately. In that precise moment, I became acutely aware of being observed, not by anything visible, but by some presence that seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously. The sensation crawled across my skin like thousands of microscopic insects, leaving ghostly trails of dread in their wake. I stood quickly, too quickly, and nearly lost my balance as vertigo swept over me. The forest appeared to ripple momentarily, trees bending inward as if drawn by some immense gravitational force centered on the slab. I blinked hard, and the distortion vanished, leaving me questioning whether I'd imagined it entirely. "I need to go back," I announced to the empty forest, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to my own ears. Turning to retrace my steps, I froze. The path I'd followed had vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar arrangement of trees and underbrush. I spun in a complete circle, searching for any recognizable landmark. Nothing appeared familiar. Even the quality of light seemed altered, no longer mid-morning brightness but the golden hue of late afternoon. Panic rose in my throat as I fumbled for my phone. The screen displayed no service as expected in this remote location, but the time reading stunned me. 5:37 p.m. Impossible. I'd left camp shortly after 9 a.m. and had been walking for no more than 2 hours. Nearly 7 hours had disappeared without explanation. A thunderous crack split the air, so loud and sudden that I instinctively dropped to the ground, covering my head with my arms. The sound reverberated through the forest like a physical force, shaking leaf litter from branches and sending vibrations through the earth beneath me. When I dared to look up, the rectangular slab had vanished, leaving only undisturbed forest floor where it had lain moments before. Despite the disorientation, some primal instinct propelled me to my feet. I needed to return to my campsite before complete darkness fell. Without consciously knowing which direction to take, I began walking with the desperate certainty of someone being pursued. Each step felt weighted, as though moving through water rather than air, yet I forced myself to continue. Remarkably, after less than 10 minutes of this frantic progress, familiar landmarks began to appear. First, a distinctive lightning-scarred oak I'd passed that morning. Then, a small stream crossing where I'd paused to drink. Finally, the edge of my clearing came into view, my red tent standing exactly as I'd left it hours before. The relief of reaching camp quickly gave way to renewed unease. Something fundamental had changed, not in the physical arrangement of my surroundings, but in the very atmosphere of this place I'd previously found so peaceful. The clearing no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Dusk settled over the clearing with unnatural swiftness. One moment, faint sunlight still filtered through the canopy. The next, shadows pooled beneath the trees like spilled ink. I hurried to prepare for the approaching darkness, hands trembling as I gathered firewood and checked my supplies. My thoughts raced chaotically, attempting to rationalize the day's events. Perhaps I'd become temporarily disoriented in the woods, a common enough occurrence for inexperienced hikers. The missing hours could be explained by a simple misreading of my phone's display. The strange slab might have been nothing more than weathered construction debris abandoned decades ago, its disappearance a trick of light and shadow. Even the thunderous sound could have been a distant lightning strike or a falling tree. Yet these explanations felt hollow, constructed to avoid confronting the inexplicable reality I'd experienced. The cold that had surrounded the slab defied the mild autumn temperature. The missing hours couldn't be dismissed as mere confusion. And that sound, that terrible crack that seemed to split reality itself, had been unlike anything I'd ever heard. As darkness enveloped the forest completely, I built a fire larger than necessary, feeding it continually until flames leaped 3 feet high. The heat and light created an illusion of safety, though I understood how tenuous that protection truly was. Whatever had occurred earlier existed beyond conventional threats of wilderness predators or harsh weather. I heated a simple meal but found myself unable to eat more than a few bites. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that intensified with each passing minute. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no owls calling, no small creatures rustling through underbrush. The absence of sound felt deliberate, as though the entire ecosystem held its collective breath. "You're letting your imagination run wild," I said aloud, desperate to hear any sound beyond the crackling of my fire. My voice sounded wrong somehow. Flatter and more distant than it should have been. I considered hiking out immediately, despite the darkness. My headlamp would provide enough illumination to follow the trail back to my vehicle. But the thought of navigating these woods at night, potentially encountering whatever presence I'd sensed earlier, seemed infinitely more terrifying than remaining in the relative security of my campsite. So I waited, constantly feeding the fire, watching the flames consume branch after branch while shadows danced at the periphery of the light's reach. Occasionally, I convinced myself I saw movement just beyond the clearing, a darker patch within the darkness, shifting between tree trunks. Each time I would stare intently until my eyes watered, only to see nothing definitive. By my watch, it was just past 10 p.m. when I first heard it. A low, rumbling sound emerging from the forest to my left. Initially, I mistook it for distant thunder, but the night sky remained clear and star-filled above the opening in the canopy. The sound persisted, gaining a rhythmic quality that disturbingly resembled breathing. Deep, labored inhalations followed by rasping exhalations. I stood abruptly, flashlight in hand, directing the beam toward the source of the noise. The light penetrated only about 20 feet into the darkness before dissipating, revealing nothing but motionless trees. Yet the breathing continued, maintaining its steady cadence. Then, impossibly, the sound shifted position. Without any accompanying rustle of movement, the breathing now emanated from behind me, on the opposite side of the clearing. I spun around, heart pounding so violently I could feel each beat in my throat. Again, my flashlight beam revealed nothing unusual, though the sound remained unmistakable. "Who's there?" I called out, immediately regretting drawing attention to myself. My voice sounded pathetically small against the vastness of the forest night. No response came, save for that continuous, rhythmic breathing. It moved again, now seemingly circling the perimeter of my clearing, always remaining just beyond the reach of my light. Whatever produced that sound made no footfalls, disturbed no branches, yet traversed the forest with apparent ease. I retreated to my tent, zipping the entrance closed as though the thin nylon could provide meaningful protection. Inside, I positioned myself in the center of my sleeping bag, flashlight gripped in white-knuckled hands, ears straining to track the movement of the breathing entity. Hours passed in this state of heightened vigilance. The breathing never ceased, continuing its circuit around my campsite with methodical precision. Occasionally it would pause briefly, and these silences proved even more terrifying than the sound itself. Moments when I imagined the entity had moved closer, perhaps standing just outside the tent wall. Around 3 a.m. the pattern changed. The breathing stopped its circular path and remained fixed in a single location directly in front of my tent entrance. The sound grew louder, deeper, as though whatever produced it had increased in size or drawn nearer. I sat frozen, scarcely daring to breathe myself, certain that at any moment the tent flap would open to reveal some unimaginable horror. Nothing happened. The breathing continued its unnatural rhythm from that fixed position for what felt like eternity. My muscles cramped from remaining motionless for so long, but fear prevented me from shifting to a more comfortable position. Any movement, any sound, might provoke whatever waited outside. Eventually, exhaustion overcame terror, and I drifted into a state of semi-consciousness. Not true sleep, but a foggy limbo where reality and nightmare blurred. In this twilight awareness, I perceived subtle changes. The breathing developed undertones that resembled words in a language just beyond comprehension, and the air inside my tent grew increasingly dense, making each inhalation feel like drawing molasses into my lungs. When dawn finally arrived, announced by a gradual lightening of the fabric walls surrounding me, the breathing ceased abruptly. One moment it dominated my awareness, the next complete silence fell. I remained motionless for another half hour, desperately listening for any indication that the entity still lurked nearby. Eventually, the normal sounds of morning began to emerge. Birds cautiously resuming their calls, small animals moving through underbrush. The forest seemed to be returning to its natural state, though the memory of that unnatural breathing lingered like a physical presence. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent entrance and peered outside. Morning mist hung between the trees, creating ethereal shapes that momentarily resembled figures before dissolving. The clearing appeared exactly as I'd left it. Fire reduced to smoldering coals, supplies arranged near the log where I'd sat. Only one detail had changed. A perfect circle of frost surrounded my tent, extending precisely 5 feet in every direction. Beyond this boundary, the ground remained untouched by frost despite the cool autumn night. Within the circle, every blade of grass, every fallen leaf, every tiny pebble wore a coating of crystalline white. I stepped carefully over this boundary, half expecting some resistance or sensation when crossing the threshold. Nothing happened. Yet the unnatural precision of the frost circle left no doubt that whatever had circled my camp throughout the night had left its mark. Decision made itself. I would leave immediately. Whatever curiosity or stubbornness might have convinced me to stay despite the previous day's events had evaporated completely. This place had become fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, but felt with absolute certainty. I packed with frantic efficiency, rolling my sleeping bag haphazardly and cramming cooking equipment into my backpack without bothering to organize anything properly. Every few seconds I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for movement or anomalies. Nothing appeared out of place, yet the sensation of being observed intensified with each passing minute. The frost circle around my tent persisted despite the strengthening morning sun, its crystalline border remaining sharply defined while dew elsewhere began to evaporate. When I finally dismantled the tent, I discovered another disturbance beneath it, a perfect impression of the rectangular slab I'd encountered in the forest, pressed into the soil as though tremendous weight had compressed the earth during the night. This discovery sent me into a fresh spiral of panic. I abandoned any pretense of methodical packing and simply stuffed the remaining items into whatever space remained in my backpack. The tent I secured to the pack's exterior with trembling hands, not caring that it remained partially damp from condensation. Before departing, I kicked dirt over the fire pit, obliterating all evidence of my presence except for the compressed soil where my tent had stood. That impression of the rectangular slab remained stubbornly visible despite my efforts to scatter leaves across it. The trail back to my vehicle should have been straightforward. A gentle descent following natural contours through increasingly sparse woodland until reaching the unmarked parking area approximately 3 miles distant. I'd hiked it easily enough upon arrival, maintaining a clear mental map of key landmarks. Within 15 minutes of departure, however, I realized something was terribly wrong. The familiar trail markers I expected, a lightning-scarred oak, a distinctive rock formation, a small stream crossing, failed to materialize. Instead, I found myself moving through increasingly dense forest where no clear path existed, forcing me to navigate around thick underbrush and fallen trees. My compass proved useless, its needle spinning continuously rather than pointing reliably north. My phone displayed no signal and, more disturbingly, showed the same time regardless of how many minutes passed, 5:37 p.m., exactly as it had shown the previous day near the rectangular slab. Panic threatened to overwhelm rational thought. I forced myself to stop, close my eyes, and take several deep breaths. When my heartbeat slowed marginally, I reopened my eyes and attempted to orient myself using the sun's position. Based on its angle, I determined what should be roughly eastward and began walking in that direction, reasoning that any sustained straight line would eventually lead to the forest's edge. The character of the woodland changed subtly as I progressed. Trees grew increasingly uniform in size and spacing, creating an almost artificial geometric pattern across the landscape. The forest floor, previously covered with typical understory plants and leaf litter, gradually transformed into a carpet-like covering of moss in varying shades of green, punctuated occasionally by clusters of pale mushrooms arranged in perfect circles. The air temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment warm enough to induce perspiration, the next so cold my breath condensed instantly. These transitions occurred without warning and without apparent relation to sunlight or shade. After what my body suggested was several hours of hiking, though my watch and phone remained frozen at 5:37, I emerged into another clearing, one significantly larger than my campsite and perfectly circular in shape. At its center stood a crude altar-like structure composed of uncut stones stacked approximately waist-high. Atop this primitive altar lay the rectangular slab. Common sense screamed at me to turn around immediately, to find another path, any path, away from this clearing and its impossible centerpiece. Yet some compulsion drew me forward step by reluctant step until I stood before the stone arrangement. The slab looked identical to what I'd encountered the previous day. The same oily iridescence playing across its surface, the same perfect geometric proportions. Now, however, symbols had appeared along its perimeter. Characters resembling no alphabet I recognized, their forms seeming to shift slightly when viewed directly versus peripherally. "What do you want?" I asked aloud, my voice sounding foreign even to myself. The question emerged without conscious intention, as though someone else spoke using my vocal cords. No audible response came, yet I experienced a sudden, overwhelming sensation of presence. Not a single entity, but many, gathered around the clearing's edge, watching with collective intensity. Though I saw nothing when turning to look, the feeling of being surrounded remained undeniable. The air directly above the slab began to distort, creating a heat mirage effect that rippled outward. Within this distortion, colors appeared that defied description. Not merely unusual hues, but colors that seemed fundamentally wrong, as though they existed in spectrums beyond normal human perception, yet had forced themselves into visibility. A high-pitched tone emanated from the slab, starting at the threshold of hearing and gradually increasing in both volume and depth until it vibrated through my entire body like some terrible instrument. The sound contained modulations reminiscent of speech, though nothing I could comprehend. Blood trickled from my nose, warm against my increasingly cold skin. The pressure inside my skull built until I feared my head might burst. I dropped to my knees before the altar, no longer in control of my motor functions as the tone reached crescendo. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. The tone vanished, the colors disappeared, the air stilled. In the sudden silence, I heard a voice, not external, but within my own mind, speaking with perfect clarity. "You have been noticed." The words carried no emotional inflection, yet conveyed profound significance. They represented neither threat nor welcome, but simple acknowledgement of a fundamental change in status. I had crossed a threshold of awareness that could not be uncrossed. Go now. Carry what you have been given. With those final words, consciousness left me. I collapsed forward, forehead striking the edge of the slab before darkness claimed my awareness completely. I awoke to the sound of automotive traffic. The transition was so abrupt, so completely disorienting, that several minutes passed before I could process my surroundings. I lay on my back beside a gravel access road, my backpack serving as an uncomfortable pillow beneath my head. Nearby, my vehicle sat exactly where I'd parked it 2 days earlier, morning sunlight glinting off its windshield. My clothing was filthy, covered with mud and various plant materials, as though I'd been dragged through underbrush. A crusty trail of dried blood extended from my nose down across my chin and neck. disappearing beneath my collar. Every muscle in my body ached profoundly, and my head throbbed with the worst headache I'd ever experienced. With tremendous effort, I pushed myself into a sitting position and surveyed my immediate environment. The forest edge stood approximately 50 yards distant, trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. Nothing about their appearance suggested anything unusual, just ordinary woodland at the cusp of autumn color change. My watch and phone had resumed functioning normally. According to both devices, less than 48 hours had passed since my departure from home. The date matched what I expected, and the time read 8:17 a.m. Somehow, I had emerged from the forest and returned to my starting point. I had no memory of walking the final miles, no recollection of how I'd navigated to the access road. The last clear memory remained kneeling before that crude altar with the rectangular slab, hearing those words in my mind before losing consciousness. With trembling hands, I unzipped my backpack, half expecting to find the slab nestled among my camping gear. Instead, everything appeared normal: tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, all packed in the haphazard manner I recalled from my frantic departure. Only one item seemed out of place: a small, smooth stone resting atop my clothing. Roughly the size of a silver dollar, its surface bore a single symbol, one of those incomprehensible characters I'd seen etched around the slab's perimeter. When I reluctantly picked it up, the stone felt neither warm nor cold, but somehow neutral, as though existing at some temperature beyond normal physical properties. I nearly threw it into the surrounding woods, but found myself unable to release it from my grip. Instead, I placed it carefully in my jacket pocket, where its weight seemed to exceed its actual mass, pulling the fabric downward with peculiar heaviness. Standing required multiple attempts, my balance compromised by exhaustion and lingering disorientation. Eventually, I managed to load my backpack into the vehicle and settle into the driver's seat. My reflection in the rearview mirror revealed a haggard stranger, face streaked with dirt and dried blood, eyes hollow with an expression I'd never seen on my own features before. Something fundamental had altered in my countenance, some essential quality I couldn't name, but recognized instantly as changed. The drive home passed in a fugue state. I navigated highways and local roads mechanically, muscle memory guiding my actions while my conscious mind retreated into a protective numbness. Only occasionally did images from the forest penetrate this emotional buffer. Flashes of the rectangular slab, the perfect frost circle surrounding my tent, the rippling distortion above the stone altar. Arriving home provided no comfort. My apartment, once a sanctuary of normalcy, now seemed artificially constrained, its straight lines and right angles appearing somehow wrong after the organic geometries of the forest. I moved through familiar rooms feeling like an intruder in my own space. In the bathroom, I finally confronted my reflection properly. Beyond the obvious signs of physical ordeal, the dirt, the dried blood, the exhaustion, another change had manifested. My eyes, previously a nondescript brown, now contained flecks of iridescence that caught the light at certain angles, creating momentary prismatic effects before settling back into ordinary coloration. I showered mechanically, watching mud and forest debris swirl down the drain. The water stung against numerous small cuts and abrasions I hadn't noticed previously, injuries with no clear origin, scattered across my arms, legs, and torso like some chaotic constellation. Clean and dressed in fresh clothing, I attempted to reintegrate into normal life. I called my supervisor to confirm my return to work the following day. I ordered delivery food since my refrigerator contained nothing edible after my absence. I responded to text messages from friends with reassurances that my camping trip had been refreshing and uneventful. All these actions felt performative, as though I were an actor portraying someone approximating normal behavior. The disconnect between this performance and my internal state grew increasingly pronounced as evening approached. Night brought new challenges. As darkness fell outside my windows, the memory of that breathing sound returned with visceral intensity. I found myself straining to hear whether similar rhythmic respiration might be present in my apartment, checking closets and under furniture for non-existent intruders. Sleep seemed an impossibility, yet exhaustion eventually claimed me around midnight. Dreams came immediately, vivid, coherent sequences unlike my usual fragmented sleep imagery. In these dreams, I stood before the stone altar in that perfect circular clearing, but now I wasn't alone. Figures surrounded me, their forms constantly shifting between humanoid and something utterly different, geometries rearranging themselves in ways that should have been impossible, yet seemed perfectly natural within the dream's context. They spoke without sound, communicating directly into my awareness. Though I couldn't consciously retain their messages upon waking, their communications left impressions, concepts rather than words, understandings that defied verbal expression. I jolted awake at precisely 5:37 a.m., drenched in perspiration despite the cool temperature of my bedroom. The small stone from my jacket pocket now lay on the pillow beside my head, though I had no recollection of placing it there. The symbol etched into its surface glowed faintly in the pre-dawn darkness, emitting a soft luminescence for several seconds, before fading to normal appearance. That morning established what would become my new routine, functioning externally while internally processing inexplicable experiences that no rational framework could accommodate. I returned to work, engaged in social interactions, maintained the outward appearance of normalcy, while carrying an awareness of something vast and impersonal that had, for reasons I couldn't comprehend, noticed me during my time in those woods. Days passed with artificial normalcy. I performed my job adequately, though colleagues occasionally commented on my distracted demeanor. I maintained minimal social engagements, finding extended human interaction increasingly difficult as the disconnect between ordinary conversation and my internal reality widened. The small stone never left my possession. I transferred it from pocket to pocket with each change of clothing, its weight a constant reminder of experiences that defied explanation. At night, regardless of where I placed it before sleeping, the stone always manifested on my pillow by morning. I stopped questioning this impossibility, accepting it as merely another aspect of my altered existence. Sleep patterns fragmented into brief periods of unconsciousness, punctuated by startling awakenings. Always these occurred at 5:37, regardless of when I initially fell asleep. Always the stone glowed briefly beside my head, its etched symbol pulsing with that strange luminescence before fading. Dreams remained unnervingly consistent. The circular clearing, the stone altar, the shifting entities communicating concepts too complex for waking comprehension. Upon awakening, I retained only emotional impressions, a sense of expectation, of preparation for something approaching, of transformation proceeding according to some incomprehensible schedule. Physical changes became increasingly difficult to ignore. The iridescent flecks in my eyes grew more pronounced, occasionally causing coworkers to ask if I'd begun wearing colored contacts. My sleep deprivation should have manifested as deteriorating health, yet instead, I experienced surges of energy at unexpected moments, periods where my senses sharpened to painful intensity, perceiving details normally filtered by ordinary consciousness. During these episodes, common objects revealed geometric complexities previously invisible to me. Conversations around me developed auditory layers, words carrying secondary meanings beneath their surface pronunciation. Most disturbingly, certain individuals I encountered seemed temporarily transparent, their physical forms becoming translucent to reveal something else moving beneath the architecture of flesh and bone, something reminiscent of those shifting entities from my dreams. These perceptual distortions typically lasted only minutes before normal awareness reasserted itself, leaving me disoriented and questioning my sanity. I researched possible medical explanations, neurological conditions, hallucinations resulting from traumatic experiences, parasitic infections contracted in the wilderness, but found nothing that comprehensively explained my symptoms. 1 week after returning from the forest, The first physical manifestation appeared in my apartment. I woke at the customary 5:37 a.m. to find a perfect frost circle surrounding my bed, identical to the one that had encircled my tent that terrible night. The crystalline border remained present for approximately 17 minutes before evaporating without leaving moisture behind, as though the frost had transformed directly from solid to gas without an intermediate liquid state. The following night brought the breathing sound, that same rhythmic, rasping respiration circling my bedroom with measured pacing. Though I saw nothing when turning on lights, the sound continued uninterrupted, maintaining its circuit until precisely 5:37 a.m., when it ceased simultaneously with my awakening. Each subsequent night introduced new phenomena, objects rearranging themselves while I slept, indecipherable symbols appearing in condensation on bathroom mirrors, brief power fluctuations affecting only my apartment unit, the persistent smell of forest soil permeating rooms despite thorough cleaning. I began documenting these occurrences, initially to provide evidence for medical professionals I considered consulting. The resulting journal quickly expanded to dozens of pages filled with detailed descriptions, sketches of symbols, timestamps of anomalous events, and records of my increasingly vivid dreams. In reviewing these notes, patterns emerged that had escaped my notice during individual incidents. The phenomena followed precise 24-hour cycles, intensifying gradually like an approaching wave. Materials containing metal responded more strongly than non-metallic objects. Electronic devices malfunctioned with increasing frequency, particularly when I experienced those episodes of heightened perception. Most significantly, all major manifestations corresponded with lunar phases. The most powerful events coincided with the new moon, when darkness was most complete. As illumination increased toward the full moon, phenomena weakened proportionally, providing brief periods of relative normalcy before beginning another cycle of intensification. 2 weeks after my return, during the apex of a new moon, I experienced what my journal entries later termed the visitation. Sleep had become nearly impossible that night, the breathing sound so loud it seemed to vibrate the walls themselves. The stone on my pillow pulsed with continuous light rather than its usual momentary glow, its etched symbol projecting onto the ceiling above my bed. At precisely 5:37 a.m., every electronic device in my apartment activated simultaneously, television displaying only static, computer booting without human input, kitchen appliances humming with power. The temperature dropped precipitously until my exhaled breath formed visible clouds in the bedroom air. The breathing sound ceased abruptly, replaced by perfect silence. In that vacuum of auditory input, words formed in my mind with the same clarity I'd experienced in the forest clearing. The preparation nears completion. The vessel accepts its purpose. A rectangular shape appeared on my bedroom wall, not projected from any visible source, but manifesting as though the wall itself had become temporarily transparent, revealing something behind ordinary reality. Within this aperture, I glimpsed the stone altar from the forest clearing, surrounded now by those shifting entities whose geometries defied comprehension. One entity separated from the others, approaching the boundary between their reality and mine. As it neared, its form stabilized into something almost human. Almost, but fundamentally wrong in proportions and movement. It extended what might generously be interpreted as a limb toward the boundary, causing the rectangular opening to ripple like disturbed water. We await your return. The door remains open. The entity withdrew. The rectangular portal collapsed, and normal reality reasserted itself with jarring suddenness. Electronics deactivated, temperature normalized, and the stone beside me ceased its illumination. Only the lingering smell of forest soil provided evidence that anything unusual had occurred. This visitation marked a turning point in my experience. Where previously I had interpreted these phenomena as something happening to me, some external force imposing itself upon my life, I now recognized a terrible truth. I had not escaped the forest at all. I had merely transported its essence into my everyday existence, carrying whatever connection had been established like a seed gradually taking root. The forest had claimed me, and distance offered no protection from its influence. 3 weeks after my camping trip, I reached a breaking point. Sleep deprivation had left me hollow-eyed and disconnected from normal interaction. Colleagues avoided me, conversations faltering when I entered rooms. My supervisor suggested medical leave, citing concerns about my deteriorating appearance and erratic behavior. What they couldn't see were the changes accelerating beneath the surface. The iridescent flecks in my eyes had expanded to consume nearly half the iris, creating an opalescent quality that shifted in different lighting. My skin had developed a subtle translucency in certain areas, particularly my fingertips, which occasionally seemed to reveal shadowy structures beneath that matched no known anatomy. Most disturbing were the symbols that had begun appearing on my body, faint patterns identical to those etched around the rectangular slab, materializing on my skin without explanation. They resembled elaborate bruising at first glance, but closer examination revealed precise geometries that no conventional injury could produce. These markings appeared primarily across my chest and back, spreading gradually outward like some cryptic language writing itself across my flesh. I finally sought medical attention when one particularly vivid episode of heightened perception persisted for over 3 hours, rendering me unable to distinguish between physical objects and their geometric underlayment. The emergency room physician found nothing physically wrong beyond signs of extreme fatigue, prescribing rest, and referring me to both a neurologist and a psychiatrist. Blood tests revealed no abnormalities, brain scans showed normal activity patterns, and a comprehensive metabolic panel indicated perfect health despite my obvious deterioration. Medical science provided no framework for understanding what was happening to me. The psychiatrist, a compassionate woman with graying hair and penetrating eyes, listened to a heavily edited version of my experiences. I omitted the more inexplicable elements, framing my symptoms within the context of possible post-traumatic stress following a disturbing experience while camping alone. She prescribed anti-anxiety medication and sleep aids, neither of which produced any effect when I attempted to use them. Returning home after these futile medical consultations, I found my apartment transformed. The breathing sound had become continuous rather than limited to nighttime hours. Frost patterns covered every wall, forming intricate arrangements of the same symbols that had appeared on my skin. The rectangular portal had manifested permanently on my bedroom wall, though it remained opaque rather than transparent, its presence marked by a subtle distortion of light around its perfectly geometric edges. The small stone, my constant companion since emerging from the forest, had changed as well. Its surface now displayed multiple symbols in a constantly shifting arrangement, each configuration briefly stabilizing before reorganizing into new patterns. When held, it transmitted sensations directly into my awareness. Not quite sounds, not quite images, but data that bypassed normal sensory channels to deposit information directly into consciousness. Through this inexplicable communication, I finally began to comprehend what was happening to me. The entities I'd encountered, or more accurately, the singular consciousness that manifested through multiple projections, existed in dimensional arrangements adjacent to conventional reality. The rectangular slab represented a threshold between these dimensional states, and I had inadvertently initiated contact by discovering it in the forest. That contact had fundamentally altered my perceptual framework, gradually restructuring my awareness to accommodate realities normally filtered by human consciousness. The process wasn't malevolent in any conventional sense. The entities neither wished me harm nor particular benefit. Their interaction with me represented something closer to clinical curiosity, an examination of how human awareness might be reconfigured to perceive beyond its evolutionary limitations. The symbols appearing throughout my experiences served as a language of transformation, each arrangement corresponding to specific alterations in consciousness, gradually building towards some predetermined configuration. My body was changing to accommodate perceptual capacities it was never designed to contain, explaining the physical transformations I'd been experiencing. Most significantly, I understood that this process had reached a critical transition point. The continuous manifestations in my apartment, the permanent rectangular portal, the accelerating physical changes, all indicated that the boundary between ordinary reality and whatever existed beyond that threshold had weakened to near transparency. A decision point approached, one I would face fully conscious rather than in the fugue state that had characterized my first encounter with the slab. This realization brought neither panic nor relief, but a strange resignation. Whatever awaited me represented not an ending, but a transition. Passage through a doorway into something beyond conventional understanding. With this comprehension came decision. I could not continue existing between states, partially transformed yet incompletely integrated into either reality. The liminal space I currently occupied caused increasing destabilization, both to my individual consciousness and to the localized environment surrounding me. The phenomena manifesting in my apartment would continue expanding outward, affecting an ever-widening area if the transition remained incomplete. The stone communicated one final concept before falling silent. Return was necessary. The circular clearing with its stone altar represented a focal point where dimensional barriers naturally thinned, allowing the completion process to occur with minimal disruption to surrounding reality. What had begun there must conclude there. With clear purpose for the first time in weeks, I packed minimally: clothing, water, the journal documenting my experiences, and most importantly, the small stone that had become both guide and translator. No camping equipment this time. Whatever transpired would not require conventional shelter. As I prepared to depart, one final manifestation occurred. The rectangular portal on my bedroom wall shifted from opacity to transparency, revealing the circular clearing bathed in moonlight. Through this opening, I could see the stone altar waiting at the center, the rectangular slab now standing vertically upon it like a doorway within a doorway. The entities gathered around the perimeter, their forms shifting between states of matter as they maintained their vigilant circle. One separated from the group, approaching the threshold where dimensional barriers had grown permeable. Its form stabilized momentarily into something almost comprehensible, a configuration of geometries that approximated humanoid structure while remaining fundamentally different. The circle completes itself. The transition awaits your arrival. The portal closed, returning to its previous opaque state. But the message remained clear. I knew where to go and what awaited me there. The forest had changed, or perhaps my perception of it had transformed. As I hiked toward the circular clearing, following an instinctive sense of direction rather than any marked trail, the woodland seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Trees appeared solid when viewed directly, yet revealed complex underlying patterns when glimpsed peripherally. The ground beneath my feet felt simultaneously solid and permeable, as though I walked upon the surface of some greater depth that remained mostly concealed. Most notably, the forest had developed an unmistakable awareness of my presence. Not consciousness in any anthropomorphic sense, but a holistic responsiveness. Branches shifting slightly to clear my path, undergrowth parting before my steps, ambient sounds adjusting their tonal qualities as I passed. The entire ecosystem functioned as an extension of whatever force awaited me at the clearing, preparing the way for my return. Time behaved erratically during this journey. Moments stretched into subjective hours, then collapsed into instantaneous transitions across significant distances. The sun's position shifted unpredictably, sometimes advancing along normal trajectories, other times jumping backward or remaining fixed despite my continued movement. My watch displayed 5:37 continuously, regardless of actual duration. The stone in my pocket pulsed with increasing warmth as I approached my destination, its symbolic language transmitting directly into my awareness without requiring visual inspection. Through this communication, I understood that temporal inconsistencies represented not malfunction, but glimpses of how reality appeared without human perceptual filters. time existing as variable density rather than linear progression. The transition into the circular clearing occurred without warning. One moment I navigated dense woodland. The next, I stood at the perimeter of that perfect circle with its central stone altar. The rectangular slab stood vertically atop the crude stone arrangement, oriented like a doorway facing the direction from which I'd approached. Unlike my previous experiences in this location, I now perceived the entities clearly. Dozens of them positioned around the clearing's edge, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter and geometric configurations. They registered in my awareness as distinct presences with individual variations, yet simultaneously as projections of a unified consciousness examining reality through multiple perspectives. The air within the clearing displayed visible currents, flowing in complex patterns that corresponded to energy exchanges between the entities and the central altar. Colors existed beyond normal spectral ranges, yet my altered perception processed these impossible hues without discomfort. Sound manifested as visible vibrations, creating synesthetic overlaps between sensory channels that would have overwhelmed my previous consciousness, but now seemed perfectly comprehensible. I approached the altar without hesitation, understanding that this moment represented the culmination of a process that had begun the instant I first encountered the rectangular slab. The entities maintained their positions but intensified their presence, their collective attention focused entirely on my progression toward the center. Standing before the vertical slab, I could now perceive its true nature. What had appeared as a simple rectangular object actually existed across multiple dimensional states simultaneously, a threshold between conventional reality and something far more complex. Its surface rippled with subtle movements, responding to proximities and potentialities as reality configurations shifted around it. The small stone in my pocket had reached painful heat. I removed it carefully, its etched symbols now glowing with steady blue-white radiance. Without conscious decision, I placed it against the surface of the vertical slab, a key inserted into its corresponding lock. Connection established, the entities communicated directly into my awareness. The transition requires consent. The doorway opens only through willing passage. Understanding flooded my consciousness. What had appeared as haunting or possession from my limited human perspective actually represented invitation and preparation. The entities had identified something in my fundamental awareness that resonated with their own existence, a capacity for perception beyond conventional human limitations. The entire process, from my initial discovery of the slab to this culminating moment, served to gradually reconfigure my consciousness to withstand direct contact with their reality without disintegration. The symbols that had appeared throughout my experiences, on the slab, in my dreams, across my skin, formed a transformative language, each arrangement corresponding to specific adjustments in my perceptual framework. The physical changes I'd undergone represented necessary modifications for consciousness to exist beyond conventional physical constraints. Now the final transition awaited, stepping through the threshold represented by the vertical slab. This passage would complete the transformation, integrating my consciousness fully into the broader reality these entities inhabited. My human form would remain, but would function merely as one configuration among many possible arrangements, allowing perception and existence across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Facing this threshold, I experienced the first hesitation since beginning my return journey. Despite understanding the nature of the invitation, fundamental human uncertainty emerged: fear of the unknown, attachment to familiar existence, concern about irreversibility. The entities recognized this hesitation, acknowledging it without judgment. Transformation preserves essence while transcending limitation. What you are remains. How you exist expands. With that assurance, my hesitation dissolved. I placed my hand against the surface of the rectangular slab, feeling resistance briefly before my flesh began passing through what appeared solid. The sensation resembled moving through extremely dense liquid. Pressure without pain, resistance without prevention. As my arm penetrated further, perception expanded exponentially. I became simultaneously aware of multiple realities layered upon each other like pages in a book, each operating according to unique physical principles yet interconnected through dimensional adjacency. The entities existed across all these layers, their shifting forms representing momentary concentrations of their essence rather than true physical boundaries. Taking a final breath in conventional human fashion, I stepped fully into the rectangular threshold. For one suspended moment, I existed between states, partially in ordinary reality, partially in something vastly more complex. Then transition completed, awareness exploding outward to encompass perspectives beyond anything conceivable to ordinary human consciousness. I remained physically present in the forest clearing, observable by conventional means should anyone happen upon this remote location. Simultaneously, I existed elsewhere, and elsewhen, perceiving through sensory arrangements that transcended biological limitation. The entities surrounded me in configurations invisible to normal human perception, our consciousnesses overlapping without merging, sharing awareness while maintaining distinct essence. From this expanded perspective, I understood the clearing's true significance, a naturally occurring convergence point where dimensional barriers thinned cyclically, allowing controlled interaction between realities. Similar locations existed globally, each serving as potential transition sites for consciousness capable of adaptation. The entities had monitored these locations for time periods beyond human historical record, occasionally identifying individuals with perceptual flexibility sufficient for contact. My camping trip had not been random chance, but unconscious response to subtle influence, drawn to that particular location at that specific time because some essential quality in my awareness resonated with the thinning dimensional barriers. The seemingly terrifying experiences that followed represented necessary recalibration of consciousness, preparing perception gradually rather than overwhelming it with sudden expansion. Now, fully transitioned, yet still maintaining human configuration, I faced a decision. Return to conventional existence with expanded awareness, or accompany the entities into deeper dimensional states beyond the forest clearing. Both options remained available, the transformation preserving autonomy while enhancing potential. The entities presented no preference, valuing individual determination above predetermined outcomes. Their purpose involved facilitating awareness expansion rather than directing its application, offering doorways without specifying destinations. Standing at this junction between realities, perceiving multiplicities that normal human consciousness filtered into singular experience, I made my choice. The forest remains watchful, its circular clearing occasionally thinning between dimensional states. The rectangular threshold still materializes during specific convergences, visible momentarily to those whose perception has begun the subtle shift toward expanded awareness. Sometimes in the deepest hours of night when conventional reality ebbs to its thinnest state, those camping in remote woodlands might perceive unusual geometries among ordinary trees, or hear breathing sounds that circle with impossible precision, or glimpse rectangular shapes reflecting starlight where no manufactured objects should exist. For those individuals, transformation has already begun. The doorway awaits their eventual return, as it awaited mine. The circle completes itself, again and again, as consciousness evolves beyond its original constraints into something simultaneous, more human, and more than human. All that remains is willing passage through the threshold.